He had married her by proxy, a name on a page and a promise from a man in San Francisco who settled such arrangements. When she arrived, stepping down from the dusty stagecoach in a plain, light blue prairie dress and a simple white apron, she was smaller than he had imagined. Her name was Lynn, and she carried a single, tightly wrapped bundle of cloth. Thomas Blackwood, a man made of long silences and the hard lines of grief, simply nodded. He was a rancher, and he needed a woman to manage his house and his young daughter, Clara. His first wife, Sarah, had been gone 2 years, and the house had been slowly losing its heart ever since. He did not expect warmth or companionship. He expected a pair of hands. He led her to the kitchen. It was clean but stark, a place for function, not joy. "This will be your domain," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "There is flour, salt pork, beans. The men eat at sundown. My daughter and I eat before." He looked at her delicate hands and quiet demeanor, and made an assumption. He assumed she knew little of a rancher's needs, of the sheer volume of food required to fuel men who worked from sunup to sundown. He thought he was getting a housekeeper, someone who could boil potatoes and perhaps mend a shirt. He did not know that within that small, quiet woman was a deep and patient knowledge of food, a knowledge born not of plenty, but of scarcity. Lynn said nothing. She simply gave a short, respectful bow of her head, her eyes taking in the cold stove, the empty shelves, the profound emptiness of the room. She placed her cloth bundle on the corner of the worn wooden table, a silent testament to the fact that she had not truly unpacked. She was a guest, a contract, not yet a fixture. Her entire world was in that bundle, ready to be picked up at a moment's notice. The bargain had been struck with her arrival, a silent agreement for shelter in exchange for service. Neither of them knew the true terms of the trade. That night, the meal was as it always was, boiled beef and hard biscuits, food that filled the stomach but did nothing for the soul. Lynn ate last, and she ate little, her gaze distant as she listened to the hollow sounds of the house. The Blackwood Ranch was a wounded place. The wound had a name, Sarah, and her absence was a physical presence in the house. It was in the empty rocking chair on the porch, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. It was in the faded curtains she had sewn, now thin and sun-bleached. It was in the way Thomas never sat at the head of the long dining table, always taking a seat to the side, as if leaving the main place vacant for someone who would never return. His daughter, Clara, was a small ghost herself, a 6-year-old with her mother's eyes and her father's silence. She moved through the rooms like a whisper, her toys left in neat, unplayed with rows. The ranch hands, a grizzled older man named Jeb and a younger, wiry cowboy named Finn, were just as guarded. They ate their meals quickly, their shoulders hunched, their conversation clipped and functional, revolving around cattle prices, broken fences, and the ever-present threat of drought. The house was not a home, it was a barracks adjacent to a field of work. Grief had hollowed it out, leaving behind a shell that was clean, orderly, and profoundly lonely. Lynn saw it all. She saw the way Clara would sometimes trace the pattern on the empty chair. She saw how Thomas's hands would pause over a particular chipped teacup before choosing another. She understood that she had not just entered a house, but a carefully preserved museum of loss. The food was a reflection of this emptiness. It was sustenance, nothing more. Jeb or Thomas would cook, throwing slabs of salted meat into a pan, boiling beans until they were a uniform mush. There was no art to it, no care. It was the taste of endurance, of just getting through another day. Lynn understood. You could not expect a feast in a house of mourning. But she also knew that a house without a warm kitchen was a house without a pulse. She watched, she listened, and she waited for her moment to begin, one small thing at a time. The first few days, she did as she was told, cleaning, sweeping, staying within the lines drawn for her. She was an observer, calculating the quiet arithmetic of the household sorrow. Her work began not with a grand announcement, but with the bread. The day's baking had always been a chore, resulting in dense, tough loaves that were more for soaking up gravy than for enjoying. On the third day, Lynn rose before the sun, while the house was still wrapped in a cool, grey silence. She took the flour, the yeast, the water, and she worked the dough not with haste, but with a deep, rhythmic patience. Her hands, which Thomas had thought so delicate, moved with unpracticed strength and certainty. When the bread came out of the old iron stove, it was different. The crust was a perfect, burnished gold, and the inside was soft and light. A warm, yeasty aroma, a scent the house had not known in years, crept under doors and up the stairs. It was the first small act, a quiet declaration. At breakfast, no one spoke of it, but they ate every last crumb. Finn, the younger hand, looked at his empty plate with a sort of wonder. Even Jeb, a man not given to praise, tore off a second piece with a thoughtful grunt. Next came the stew. The usual ranch stew was a watery broth with tough chunks of meat and whatever vegetables hadn't yet withered. Lynn took the same ingredients, but she seared the meat first, creating a rich, dark crust. She added a wild herb she'd found growing near the creek, a plant the men had walked past 1,000 times without seeing. She let it simmer for hours, the flavors melding into something deep and complex. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was different. It was not the silence of endurance, but of quiet appreciation. The men ate slowly, savoring each spoonful. Lynn had not added anything extravagant. She had simply added care. She found a neglected patch of mint and thyme behind the kitchen, choked with weeds. Patiently, she cleared it, tended to it, and brought it back to life. Soon, the simple roast chickens were fragrant with herbs, and the potatoes were roasted with a sprig of thyme. One small thing at a time, she was breathing life back into the kitchen, and the kitchen was breathing life back into the house. The first to surrender completely was Clara. The child had watched Lynn with wide, solemn eyes, a silent observer of this quiet revolution. One afternoon, Lynn took a small amount of rice flour and sugar, things she had requested from the general store, and fashioned a small, sweet rice cake, shaping it into a flower. It was something from her own childhood, a memory made tangible. She placed it on a small plate and set it on the kitchen table where Clara was drawing. She said nothing, simply went back to her work. Clara looked at the cake, then at Lynn, then back at the cake. After a long moment, she picked it up and took a tiny, hesitant bite. A look of slow, dawning surprise crossed her face. She ate the entire thing, then slipped out of the kitchen. An hour later, she returned and silently placed a single, bright yellow wildflower on the table beside Lynn's kneading bowl. It was a treaty, an acceptance. From that day on, Clara was her shadow, chattering away in the kitchen, telling Lynn about her day, her dreams, the names of the ranch horses. The men were next. Finn became her unabashed champion. He'd say, holding up a scone still warm from the oven, "I do believe this is the finest thing I have ever eaten." Jeb's resistance crumbled more slowly, but it crumbled nonetheless. He started finding excuses to be in the kitchen around midday, drawn by the smell of baking pies, apple, peach, berry, their crusts flaky and golden. Soon, word of the food at the Blackwood Ranch began to spread. Cowboys from neighboring spreads, timing their work to pass by around sundown, would stop in, ostensibly to talk cattle with Thomas. "Heard you might have an extra plate, Blackwood," they'd say, their eyes on the kitchen door. The long, silent dining table began to fill up. There was laughter now, storytelling. Lynn would simply bring out more food, another roast chicken, a bigger pot of stew, another pie. She never seemed to run out. She was feeding not just the ranch, but a growing piece of the county. She was the quiet center of it all, moving from stove to table in her plain blue dress, her face serene, her hands always busy. Thomas noticed everything. He noticed the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing from the kitchen. He noticed the way the ranch hands lingered after their meals, their faces relaxed and content. He saw the visiting cowboys who now tipped their hats to Lynn with a reverence they usually reserved for a good horse or a straight-shooting man. The house felt different. It smelled of baking bread and simmering herbs instead of dust and sorrow. It felt warmer, fuller. He said nothing to Lynn about it. Words of praise or thanks were buried too deep under layers of grief and habit. But he watched her. He saw how she never sat until everyone else was served, how she took the smallest portion for herself, how she worked from the first light of dawn until long after the house was dark. One morning, Lynn came into the kitchen to find the wobbly leg of her work table had been fixed. A new brace of smooth, sanded wood had been fitted, making it solid and steady. The day before, it had tilted every time she kneaded dough. Now, it was firm. There was no note, no explanation. But she saw the small pile of wood shavings swept neatly into a corner, and she knew it was Thomas's work. It was his way of speaking, a silent acknowledgement offered in wooden labor. It was a thank you, a repair, an answer to her small acts of care. Later that week, a man from town rode up. He was Mr. Davies, the banker, a man whose smile was as polished as his boots. He dismounted and strode onto the porch, his manner easy and familiar. "Thomas, my friend," he boomed, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. He was invited for the midday meal, and he lavished praise on Lynn's cooking. A veritable artist, he declared, sampling a slice of apple pie. "You are a lucky man, Thomas," but as he spoke, Lynn watched his eyes. They were cold and sharp, constantly scanning, assessing. After the meal, he and Thomas went into the small study and closed the door. Lynn, clearing the table, could hear the low murmur of their voices. She caught a few phrases. "Just a formality," Davies said, his voice smooth as butter. A standard review of the loan. She saw him later, walking near the pens, his gaze lingering on the cattle with a look that was not admiration, but calculation. A small, cold knot of unease formed in her stomach. Something was wrong. The banker's smile did not match his eyes, and his pleasant words felt like stones wrapped in silk. That summer, a blight fell upon the valley. The usually lush grazing pastures turned a sickly, rust-colored brown, the grass withering under the relentless sun. The cattle, which should have been fattening for the autumn market, began to thin. Their ribs started to show, and they moved with a listless energy. Panic, a quiet but corrosive force, began to seep into the rhythm of the ranch. Feed was expensive, and Thomas was already stretched thin. The loans from Mr. Davies hung over him like a constant, low-hanging cloud. The bounty of Lynn's kitchen, which had seemed so effortless, was now under threat. Thomas announced that they would have to tighten their belts. Rations were cut. The visiting cowboys stopped coming, knowing the ranch had to look after its own. The laughter in the dining room faded, replaced by the old, familiar silence of worry. The men ate quickly again, their faces grim. The pressure mounted with every cloudless day. The ranch, which had just begun to heal, felt precarious once more, balanced on the edge of a financial knife. Lynn watched as Thomas grew more gaunt, the lines around his eyes deepening. He spent his days riding out to check on the diminishing pastures, returning covered in dust, his face a mask of frustration. The crisis was no longer just an absence of joy, it was an active threat to their survival. The land itself seemed to be turning against them. Lynn felt the shift keenly in her kitchen. The flour sacks felt lighter, the stores of smoked meat smaller. She knew that what she did next would matter more than any pie or scone she had ever baked. The challenge was no longer to create delight, but to sustain life itself from a dwindling larder. It was a challenge she knew intimately. The hard season had arrived, and it would test everything. One evening, Thomas walked into the pantry to find Lynn standing amidst the shelves, a ledger, and a piece of chalk in her hand. She was surrounded by sacks of flour, beans, and rice, her expression one of intense concentration. He saw the careful way she was portioning things out, and a surge of frustration rose in him. He was about to tell her to be more frugal, that every grain counted, when he saw what she was truly doing. She was not just counting. She was calculating, planning, strategizing. She had created a system, a visual inventory of every edible thing on the ranch. She looked up and saw the harshness in his face soften into confusion. For the first time, she spoke to him not as a servant, but as an equal partner in a desperate struggle. "In my village," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "the hunger teaches you. It teaches you that a potato has 3 parts. The peel can be fried. The flesh can be boiled. The water you boil it in can start a soup." She gestured to the side of smoked bacon. "We will use every part. The fat for cooking, the meat for flavor, the rind to soften the beans. She told him of the edible greens and roots that grew along the creek bed, plants the cowboys ignored but that she knew could be turned into a nourishing meal. She explained how to stretch flour with potato mash to make the bread last longer, how to make a small amount of meat feed 10 men by turning it into a rich, thick stew fortified with foraged vegetables. This was not just cooking. This was the science of survival, a deep, ingrained wisdom born of hardship he could barely imagine. As he listened, Thomas saw her for the first time. He saw past the quiet, obedient woman he had married by mail order. He saw a strategist, a survivor, a woman of immense strength and hidden depths. Her quiet competence was not an accident of nature, it was a skill honed in the crucible of famine. He felt a wave of shame for his earlier assumptions, replaced by a profound, humbling respect. She was not just caring for his house. She was defending it. Mr. Davies returned 2 weeks later, his horse kicking up dust in the parched yard. He wore the same expression of deep, sympathetic concern he had practiced for such occasions. "Thomas," he said, his voice grave as he surveyed the thin cattle. "I am sorry to see this. The bank, you understand, is worried." Very worried. They sat in the study, the door pointedly left ajar this time. Davies spread a series of papers on the desk. "With the herd thinning, the value of your collateral has dropped significantly. I've been fighting for you, trying to convince the board to give you more time, but their patience is wearing thin." His words were a polite strangulation. He let the silence hang in the air before delivering the solution he had prepared all along. "However," he continued, his tone brightening, "I have a proposal. A neighbor has made a generous offer on the north pasture. The one with the deep well. It was the best land Thomas had, the only part of the ranch that remained green. If you sell that parcel, you could clear your debt entirely. Be free and clear. It seems the wisest course, a way to salvage the rest." Thomas felt the trap close. Davies was not offering a solution, he was cornering him. The neighbor was a known associate of the banker, a vulture who circled struggling homesteads. Selling that land would save him from the loan but cripple the ranch for good, leaving it without its most vital water source. He would be trading a quick death for a slow one. Despair washed over him. He felt trapped, outmaneuvered by a man who wielded ledgers and legal documents like weapons. He saw no other way out. The polite, smiling man across the desk was about to take the heart of his family's legacy, and he was doing it with a handshake and an expression of regret. Lynn had been listening from the kitchen. The banker's oily voice, laced with false sympathy, confirmed the cold knot of dread she had felt during his first visit. She remembered his calculating eyes, his feigned praise. She also remembered something else. Weeks ago, while searching for old canning jars, she had stumbled upon a dusty wooden box in the back of a storage closet. Inside, among Sarah's preserved flowers and bundles of letters, was an old ranch ledger. It was Sarah's ledger, her handwriting neat and clear. At the time, Lynn had closed the box, feeling like an intruder. Now, she knew she had to look again. That night, while the house slept, she retrieved it. With a single lamp casting a pool of golden light on the kitchen table, she opened the old book. She could not read all of Sarah's cursive notes, but she could read numbers. Numbers were a universal language. She lit another lamp and went into Thomas's study, pulling out his current ledger. For hours, she sat, comparing the two books side by side. Her finger traced the columns, the payments made before Sarah's death and the payments made after. And then she found it. A discrepancy. A loan payment Thomas had recorded was entered as a smaller amount in Davies's official statements. Then she found another. The interest rate, which had been fixed, suddenly jumped after Sarah was gone, a change noted in the margins of Davies's letters as a standard market adjustment, but in Sarah's old book, the original loan agreement, which Lynn could decipher from the legal language, clearly stated a fixed rate for the entire term. Grief had made Thomas careless, and Davies had taken advantage. The banker had been slowly, systematically bleeding the ranch dry, counting on the fact that the grieving widower was not paying close enough attention. One small theft at a time. Lynn's heart pounded, not with fear but with a cold, clear anger. she took a clean sheet of paper and, with painstaking care, began to copy the relevant pages from both ledgers, placing the columns side by side so the fraud was undeniable. Mr. Davies arrived the next afternoon, the deed of sale in his hand. He brought the neighbor with him, a hard-faced man who stood by the door like a silent vulture. They had Thomas cornered in the main room, the papers spread on the table where the family ate. The air was thick with the heat of the day and the finality of defeat. "Just sign here, Thomas," Davies said, pointing with a manicured finger. "And all this pressure will be gone." Thomas picked up the pen, his hand heavy. The ranch his father had built, the land Sarah had loved, was about to be fractured. At that moment, Lynn entered from the kitchen. She wore her simple blue dress and white apron, her face as calm and unreadable as ever. She carried no weapon, raised no alarm. She walked to the table and, in the heavy silence, she placed Sarah's old ledger beside the banker's documents. Next to it, she laid her own hand-copied sheets, the columns of numbers stark and clear. She did not say a word. She simply pointed. She pointed to a date in Sarah's book, a payment recorded. Then she pointed to the corresponding entry in Davies' statement, a lower figure. She pointed to the original loan agreement's fixed interest rate. Then she pointed to the inflated rate on his current papers. She looked at Thomas. His eyes followed her finger, and in an instant, he understood. The fog of grief and despair lifted, replaced by a terrible, cold clarity. He saw the years of quiet fraud laid bare. Mr. Davies' face, which had been a mask of confident sympathy, collapsed. The color drained from it. He had been so sure of his victory, so dismissive of the quiet Chinese woman in the kitchen. He had never imagined she could read, let alone reason. To be exposed not by a lawyer or a lawman, but by a silent cook with a dusty ledger, was a humiliation he could not withstand. He stared at Lynn, his mouth slightly agape. Without a word, he gathered his papers, turned, and walked out of the house, his neighbor trailing behind him like a dog. The threat had not been vanquished by a shout, but by a quiet, unassailable truth. That evening, the house was still. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the debt lifted. Lynn was in the kitchen, wiping down the table. Her small cloth bundle, the one she had arrived with, sat in the center of the table. Her purpose, she believed, was served. She had repaid the shelter she had been given. She was ready to leave. Thomas walked in, his boots soft on the wooden floor. He saw the bundle. He saw the question in her posture. He walked past the table to the high shelf where Sarah's things were kept. He took down the second teacup, the one he had not allowed anyone to touch for 2 years. He brought it to the table and set it down opposite his own. He looked at Lynn, his eyes holding hers. "Stay," he said. The word was quiet, but it filled the entire room. It was more than a request, it was a plea, a declaration. Lynn looked from the cup, to his face, and back to the cup. A slow, small nod was her answer. She reached for her bundle, and for the first time since she had arrived, she began to unpack. Thank you for watching.